this your book? Good evening. Good evening. It is great to see everyone. I hope that you've had a good week so far. We want to encourage you to continue to remember all of those that are on our prayer list. Travis Nelms spent a couple of days in the hospital at Medical City, Louisville, but he is at home, and we are glad of that. But continue to pray for him as he recovers from pneumonia. It's good to see Millard and Nancy with us this evening. Glad y'all are able to be here. We do want to ask that you would remember David Pippin in your prayers. David is in the hospital at Denton Presby with pneumonia, and there are some other complications, and so I know that they would appreciate our prayers on their behalf. So please keep them in your prayers. It's wonderful for us to be together tonight. I know if you are on Facebook, you have seen probably some of the pictures from Reach Week at Pettyjohn Springs, and they are having a wonderful time. Even though it is very hot, they are enjoying their time at camp, and so I know it's always a fun time of year for them. Keep praying for them and pray for their safety, and pray that as they continue to go through their lessons there at camp, that lives will be transformed. We're so thankful to so many people that are serving there this week. Again, it's good for us to be together at this time. Rick is going to lead us in songs. Let's all be standing together as he leads us.
We're going to sing number 111, Come We That Love the Lord. Let's sing it. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord, join in a song with sweet accord, and thus surround the throne, and thus surround the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our songs abound and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground to fairer worlds on high, to fairer worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Be seated.
Well, we're continuing our summer series tonight, and I'm grateful to my good friend Jacob Hawk for being able to be here tonight. I'm glad that I am able to be here tonight so that I can stop him from saying anything untrue regarding my golf game and whether I cheat or not. So Jacob is currently serving as the young adults and singles minister for the Preston Crest Church of Christ. He holds bachelor and master's degrees in Bible and ministry from Harding University. He has preached for churches in Llano, Kerrville, and Wichita Falls, Texas. And Jacob produces a weekly podcast titled Road Talk, Navigating Your Journey. And that airs each week, and he records that from his office. I would encourage you, if you're not following that, to make sure that you go and subscribe to that and follow his podcast. He's also an author. He enjoys writing, and he has authored several books. He's currently pursuing his doctorate in Christian leadership from Liberty University. And most importantly, Jacob is married to his beautiful wife, Suzanne, who is an elementary school principal in Mesquite. And he is blessed with 3 handsome sons, Hayden, Hudson, and Hewitt. I consider Jacob to be a very dear friend of mine, and I'm so thankful that he is here with us this evening to share with us a lesson titled Trust Like Joseph. Jacob, come preach the word.
Well, good evening. It is always a joy to be here with you at Louisville. It is a joy to have Keith here in the audience. He's never been here when I've been here, and he usually tries to go the opposite direction when he knows I'm coming. So I'm glad that we can be together, and I would never say anything bad about Keith in his presence. Just behind his back. But Keith, glad that you're here. I'm so thankful that you have the Harris family here with you at Louisville. Keith is one of my very best friends, and I know that they are blessing you and that you are blessing them. Have you ever had a meeting that went very differently than you expected the meeting to go? It was mentioned in my bio a couple of moments ago that I preached in Llano, Texas. That was my first preaching job out of college. Llano, if you aren't familiar where it is, very small, beautiful little town, central Texas, northwest of Austin. And one day I was sitting in my office and I got a phone call. And on the other end of the line was a man named Paul. Paul was an elderly man in our church. He was a widower. He was about 95 years old. He lived about a quarter mile or less from our building. So close to the building, he would actually ride his motorized wheelchair to church, would drive himself down the street. And he called me and he said, Jacob, he said, I need you to come over. I need to talk to you. And I said, okay, Paul, I'll be happy to come. I'm finishing up a sermon here and have to make a couple of phone calls, but I'll come after lunch. He said, no, that won't work. I need you to come now. So I said, okay, I'll be there in just a minute, literally just a minute, because he was so close to the building. Went to his house, walked through the front door, and by house it was a very small one-bedroom apartment. He was laying in bed, didn't look well. So I grabbed a chair and I scooted it next to his bed, and I sat down on the end of the chair and leaned in real close. I said, Paul, what's on your mind? What do you need to talk about? Obviously, this is a big deal. What do you need? I'm here. He leaned up out of bed and he said, Jacob, he said, I'm out of Ensure, and I was wondering if you'd go to the grocery store and get me a pack. Said, that's what you needed? That's what I needed. Could you do that for me? Could you go to the grocery store and get me a pack? And I said, well, you want vanilla? Do you want chocolate? Do you want strawberry? Sure, I don't have anything else going on. More than happy to go and get you some Ensure. That was a meeting that was dare I say, totally different than what I was expecting. Sometimes our meetings are different because we frankly just don't listen. And so the conversation goes a totally different direction that we didn't expect. You may have heard the story. I heard the story recently about a lady who responded on Sunday morning to the sermon. During the invitation song, she walked down the aisle. The preacher was standing right there in the middle. He greeted her. He said, "What can I do for you?" She said, "Preacher, I need you to pray for my hearing." And so he grabbed her ears and he prayed this very bold, powerful prayer, expecting God to answer immediately. And he said, "Sister," after the prayer was over, "Sister, how's your hearing now?" And she said, "Preacher, my hearing's next Thursday." Another situation, another meeting, another conversation that goes very differently than what you thought. I've been asked tonight to speak on the topic of trusting like Joseph. And in Genesis chapter 48, Joseph has a meeting that was very different than what he expected. In Genesis chapter 48, Jacob, his beloved father, the patriarch of the family, the 12 sons, which would become the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob is 147 years old, and Jacob calls a family meeting. And Joseph knows this meeting's important. If someone has a runny nose at the age of 147, you know this could be the final conversation. So Joseph goes to see his father, Jacob, and he takes with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And I can guarantee you tonight, even though Joseph can't be here on stage to confirm this, I can guarantee you tonight that this was a meeting very different than what Joseph had expected. Usually when we talk about trusting like Joseph, I think we probably think about some different stories in his life. We might think about him being unjustly thrown into prison. We might think about him sitting in prison for over a decade when he thought he was going to be released. We might think about him at the end of his life, or end of the story of Genesis, not his life, but end of the narrative, when his remorseful brothers apologize for what they had done so many years before, throwing him into the pit, selling him into slavery. Joseph makes that powerful statement, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." And all of those stories certainly speak to the trust and the faith that Joseph placed in God. But I think that this story in Genesis 48, though it's not as famous, is equally as powerful when we talk about placing trust in God. As I've said, it's a touching setting. Everyone in the room knows it's the final meeting. Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, walked through the door, and I love how the text tells us in verse 2 that Israel, that's Jacob, Israel strengthened himself, and he sat up on the bed. There are a lot of things in life that will keep us in bed. Things we don't want to face, jobs, problems, stress, our boss. But there's one thing that always gives us the energy to get up out of bed, and that's family. This was the exact adrenaline rush that Jacob needed at the age of 147 to sit up and to have a conversation, because his son Joseph and his two grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim, were in his home. And Jacob tells Joseph, "I've got some good news for you. Your two boys, Manasseh and Ephraim, the two boys that were born to you in Egypt, I'm going to adopt them as my own sons. Now that's a big deal, that Jacob at the end of his life would adopt two grandsons as his own sons. And there are many theories as to why Jacob made this choice. Some suggest that it could be because he's so disgusted with his oldest sons, Reuben and Simeon, who had committed grievous sins, especially Reuben, that he is going to write them out of the will, out of the inheritance, out of the blessing, and he is going to give Manasseh and Ephraim the portion that Reuben and Simeon would have received, bringing the total of his sons, when you push Reuben and Simeon out, back to 12 with Manasseh and Ephraim, because the Hebrews viewed 12 as a complete and whole number, and technically they would split the double portion of inheritance which Reuben would receive because he was the oldest child. That's one theory. I think it's a plausible theory. Another theory is more practical in nature. It could be simply Jacob's way of thanking Joseph for saving the family. He didn't have to do that. He could have had his brothers killed. He didn't have to forgive them. He didn't have to provide them a home in Egypt during the famine. And so at the end of his life, Jacob shows some appreciation to Joseph, and Jacob says, "These two sons are now my sons." We don't know for sure why Jacob makes this choice, but this we do know. Manasseh and Ephraim were considered Jacob's sons. They would receive land. They would receive inheritance. They would receive blessing. Just like all of Jacob's other sons. So I think this is an interesting part of the story. Jacob summons them and he says, "Bring me the boys so I might bless them," Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob asks the question in verse 8, "Who are these?" Who are these? That's a strange question when you know who's in your presence. What do you mean, who are these? Again, people speculate what's going on here. Some argue, well, he's 147. His eyesight cannot be too strong. So he needs clarification as to who he's looking at. Possible. It could be that Jacob is simply following Hebrew Jewish protocol. That whenever you would bless someone, you would have them step forward, you would officially pronounce their name, and you would pass on the blessing. So Joseph brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to the patriarch of the family, to Jacob's feet, and Joseph does so strategically. He puts Manasseh on the left side of Jacob so that he could be blessed with Jacob's right hand, because Manasseh is the older child. And he puts Ephraim on the right side of Jacob so that he could be blessed with Jacob's left hand because he's the younger child. Joseph, I chuckle when I read this. Joseph surely remembers his family's history. They have a tendency to mess these things up. I'm sure Joseph is thinking about the story of his heritage. When Jacob, his father, conspires with Rebekah, his grandmother, to trick his grandfather, Isaac, over the birthright. And Jacob's the one who gets the birthright. He's not the older one, he's the younger one. And so now Joseph has his two sons looking at his father, his boy's grandfather, remembering the story of his grandfather. And so Joseph, as the father, puts Manasseh here and puts Ephraim here. Has to be thinking to himself, "Dad, don't mess this up again. Learn from your own mistakes." And it's in that very moment that the meeting takes the turn that Joseph did not expect. The turn that was not even close to his radar. testing his trust. Jacob, the patriarch, switches hands. He puts the hand for the older on the head of the younger, and he puts the hand for the younger on the head of the older, and Ephraim receives the birthright, the blessing, when it technically belonged to Manasseh. It was a symbolic passing of blessing from one generation to the next. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was irrevocable. Once it's done, there's no taking it back. And the text tells us that Joseph became very displeased. And he tried to stop it. The word for displeased there in verse 17 can also be translated as wicked. Almost like Joseph believed that his father Jacob was doing an evil, immoral thing. And we can just picture Joseph watching it happen, lunging at his aged, decrepit father to prevent this symbolic tragedy that would last for generations. And Joseph speaks up and he tells his father Jacob, "No, Dad, stop. Wrong boy. Manasseh is the older one, not Ephraim. I mean, for goodness sakes, this runs in our family. Surely we're not going to get this wrong again." Isaac the younger was chosen over Ishmael the older. Joseph the younger had been chosen over his older brothers. Jacob the younger had been chosen over Esau. And now Ephraim the younger is going to be chosen over Manasseh. No wonder Joseph is unhappy. But the old man speaks up. And Jacob says, "Joseph, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. The younger will be greater than the older, and he will become a group of nations." One writer phrased it this way. I love this statement. Jacob might be losing his eyesight, but he is not losing his insight. He might be losing his eyesight, but he's not losing his insight. And as we turn the pages of the Old Testament, it all happened just like Jacob's prophetic voice said that it would. When a census is taken in Numbers chapter 1, Ephraim numbers over 40,000, Manasseh only 32,000. In his farewell address in Deuteronomy 33:17, Moses referred to the thousands of Manasseh and the 10,000s of Ephraim. And you'll probably remember that in the days of the divided kingdom, when Judah's on the south and Israel's on the north, Israel's the larger of the two, and Israel is also called what? Ephraim. The younger will be greater than the older. Jacob might be losing his eyesight. He's not losing his insight. He knows what he's doing. And friends, we may or may not realize it when we read this story, but this story is so picturesque of our relationship with God, specifically in the trust that it requires. I mean, aren't you thankful that God's boundaries for family extend much further than ours? Aren't you thankful for that? Jacob chose Manasseh and Ephraim to be his sons. He adopted them. He had no reason to do that. They were half Egyptian. They didn't work on the farm back in Canaan. They didn't attend the family holiday parties. They weren't familiar with the family inside jokes. They didn't understand the experience of the family traditions. They were outsiders. But Jacob brought them in to the family. And God brought all of us into the family. If we are Christians tonight, we weren't born to the right people. We didn't have the law. We didn't have the prophets. We didn't have the temple. But God, through His grace, brought us into the family. And there are so many scriptures that speak of this in the New Testament. I know you're familiar with Romans 8, 16 and 17, when Paul says that if God has placed His Spirit in our hearts, we are children, we are heirs. And by that Spirit, we cry, Abba, Father. In Romans 11, Paul has this great analogy of God grafting two trees together out of two different branches, and they become one, representing the Jews and the Gentiles. We've been grafted in. In Galatians 4:6 and in Ephesians 1:5, Paul uses the terminology, you are adopted sons. Adoption is very special. Anyone who would adopt a child is to be honored and praised. Back to when I was preaching in Llano, when I was there was a family that they had for a long time wanted to have a baby. They couldn't have a baby, so they adopted their first child, and then 5 years later, to their surprise and to the doctor's surprise and everyone's surprise, they conceived a child. And so they had two daughters. Older one was adopted, younger one was biological, 5 years apart. And when I was preaching in Llano, the adopted child was about 21, and the biological child was about 16 or 17. And I remember specifically one day at a lunch, they got into kind of an argument. And the older child, the adopted child, looked at the younger child, the biological child, and she said this. She said, you know, Mom and Dad, they had to have you, but they chose me. God chose you. He didn't have to have you. He doesn't need you. But He chose you. He wanted you to be part of the family. He brought you in when you did nothing to deserve it. That's because God's boundaries for family extend so much further than ours. And aren't you also thankful that God's ways are higher than our ways? And that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Joseph, the son, tried to correct Jacob, the father, because the son didn't think the father had a clue what he was doing. The son thought the father was doing it totally the wrong way, and so the son, Joseph, even lines up his children before the father, their grandfather, just to make sure that Jacob doesn't mess it up. He thinks to himself, maybe I'll help him out a little bit, so it goes the way that I have planned. Joseph thought Jacob was foolish. But the whole time, Jacob knew exactly what he was doing. Are there things in your life tonight that you feel like God is doing backwards? Are there things in your life tonight that you feel like you need to help God with? Now, He doesn't have a clue what's going on. Are there things in your life tonight that you're saying to God, God, it's not supposed to be this way? Maybe it's your job. Maybe you go to the office every day and you think to yourself, By now, I was supposed to be beyond this, and I don't understand why I'm not. Maybe it's your home. Maybe you find yourself saying, I was supposed to have a calm house, a happy family, and I don't. I was supposed to retire at this age, and I haven't. I took care of my body my entire life. I was supposed to be healthy in my later years, but I'm not. And God, I need you to rearrange your providence in my life because you've missed something along the way. And you probably need me to help you. Maybe it's your financial future. I invested, I saved, I had the best advisor, and I'm broke. What is God doing? Maybe it's your mental health. I've seen a counselor. I've read a book. And everyone knows I've been praying. Why don't I feel any better? Why don't I have any happiness in my life? Sometimes you might pray and you might wonder, like this microphone, is this thing on? Are you listening? Am I not praying right? Am I not praying enough? Where are you? Why aren't you fixing this? But as hard as it is, sometimes, let me rephrase that. Not sometimes, all the time. Like Joseph, we have to take a step back. And we have to realize God knows what he's doing. He doesn't make mistakes. And he doesn't need my help. He will never lose his eyesight, and he will certainly never lose his insight. And the most comforting thing that we can ever come to believe in life is when we finally admit there is a God, and I'm not him. And I'm going to trust him to do it his way, even when I don't understand. Many years ago, there was a famous preacher in our brotherhood named T.B. Larimore. T.B. Larimore went all over the country holding gospel meetings. Many of them lasted for weeks at a time. If you can see there on the flyer on the right side of the screen, this was from 1894 in Sherman, Texas. I believe this was the longest gospel meeting in history. Someone, hopefully who was not alive back then, still alive tonight, but hopefully somebody can tell me if that's right or wrong. But look how often they were meeting, 4 and 8:20 p.m. every day, and at 11, 4, and 8:20 every Sunday. And this gospel meeting went for weeks. And it will continue indefinitely, as long at least as may seem best for this community and the cause of Christ. We can't get people to come to a weekend seminar anymore. My, how times have changed. These people took weeks out of their life to go and hear the word. But other than being famous for holding gospel meetings and long gospel meetings at that, T.B. Larimore was known as the preacher poet. And his sermons would often read like poetry. And the preacher poet, T.B. Larimore, was famous for telling one story about his life. When he was a small child, his family did not have much money. So he worked on a farm that was next to his parents' land. He would work all week long, Monday through Friday. Then he would come home Friday evening when the work was finally done, which often meant he was coming home at dark. And between his parents' land and this farm was a very small footbridge that crossed over a quick-moving stream, and the bridge did not have railings on the side. And on one Friday evening, he was heading back to his parents' house after a week of work. And there was very thick fog. And Larimore wondered to himself, how in the world am I going to cross? And then he looked through the fog and through the haze of the night. And he saw his mother on the other side of the bridge, holding a lantern, swinging it back and forth, showing him the light and the path for him to go. Larimore crossed over the bridge, was reunited with his mother. But it's interesting what Larimore said about that experience. Larimore said, what was on the other side was not as important as who was on the other side. If anyone else was standing on the other side of that bridge with a lantern saying, you can make it, I wouldn't go. But if my mom is standing there with a lantern saying, sweetheart, come on home, you're fine, then I knew I could make it. Church, there are a lot of things in life that God asks us to do, and many of them often don't make sense. But the reason we trust God is not because of what we've been told to do. The reason we trust God is because of who told us to do it. And if God says we can, we can. If God says we can handle it, we can handle it. If God says He's going to be there, He's going to be there. And like Joseph, we don't always understand. In fact, I would dare say many times we don't have a clue. But God knows what's best. There is a God, and we aren't Him. That's what trusting like Joseph is all about. And that is a beautiful way for us to live. I always love being here with you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for loving on my good friend Keith. Let's pray together. Father, you are God. We submit to you. Father, help us to trust you when life doesn't make sense. Father, remind us that you will never lose your eyesight. You will never lose your insight. Remind us that you don't need our help. Remind us to trust you above all things. We love you, God. We need you. And we pray this tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. May God bless you.